Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana. Hei huriahi mā tātou e te rangi nei. Aroha atu aroha mai tātou ia tātou katoa. Hui tai kia. Kia ora tātou everybody, good to see you. Welcome to Melissa and Helen, our colleagues from Manaaki Whenua and Ag Research, here to talk to us about achieving greater impact from research. And as sort of excitedly getting a bit of evidence around this, some really interesting research that Melissa has done, and then Helen's going to talk to us about what that looks like in practice. Just in case you're not aware, these webinars are brought to you by iPEN, which is a collaborative effort across all 7 CRIs to basically lift the boat so that everyone has got strengthened capability and capacity in this area. But that's enough from me. I want to hand over to Melissa and Helen, who you're here to hear from. So I'd like to hand over to Melissa, who is going first. So over to you, Melissa.
Great. Let's see if that works. So can I get because now I can only see you, Cara, can I get a thumbs up that you can see the screen? If you can.
I can't see anything yet. And we still can't see you. I can't anyway. Oh, some people can. Oh.
Can anybody else see my screen? Can anybody else
We've
see
got
my
other
screen?
thumbs up. That's good.
Yeah, we can see it and you,
Okay.
Melissa.
Okay, perfect.
You're
perfect. Good. So apologies, Cara. This is all going to pass you by if you can either you can't see me or see the screen.
I'll open the slides in the background.
Awesome. So really appreciate, thank you for the karakia, and really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to folks a little bit about doing integrative research and to be in such esteemed company with Helen. So thanks for the opportunity. And as Cara said, I'm going to talk a little bit about why would we use integrative research, because it's been a bit of a dominating theme in my research career for a little while. So just I work at Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research, but the journey, I guess the seeds of my interest in integrative research goes back about kind of 10 or 11 years. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of context for that journey, because it helps inform why and what I've been looking at, and therefore the research that we've done. So about 11 years ago, I started to work as a technical lead for the Selwyn-Waihora collaborative limit setting process, which is the catchment that you can see here. And if you are in Lincoln or Christchurch, that's the catchment that you're sitting in. And it was so that process was one of the first NPSFM, National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, one of the first kind of collaborative policy making processes where community were at the kind of heart of the decision making. So I'd brought together a technical team that covered about 13 different natural science disciplines, social science, economic, as well as folks doing cultural assessments. And we worked super closely with policy and planners, as you can imagine, but also very much in kind of service of this community-led zone committee. And one of our jobs was to understand predict and communicate the consequences of different things that people might do on this land on the cultural, social, economic, and environmental values of that community. So you're already blurring a whole bunch of both knowledge systems, disciplines, but also working across between knowledge and values. And one of the interesting things was this zone committee and the group and the community groups that are sitting around it were made up of people with quite a broad range of expertise, but mainly non-scientific. And so what we not only we were working across all of these different fields, but what we needed to do was we needed to create information and communicate it in ways that were kind of credible and legitimate to this broad group of people, as well as to the policy and planners and to the lawyers and to the technical people. So it was quite a there was quite a lot going on, and it happened to be in one of the most conflicted, high nutrient conflicted areas in the country, lots of political interest, and so it was quite a sort of a what's the word, a sort of, not a furnace, but a crucible. It was kind of quite a crucible, and in terms of that, there were aspects kind of all through the few years that this is what it felt like. It felt like we were kind of flying by the seat of our pants for a lot of it. And I know this looks like I'm farting my way across the landscape, which I probably did as well a bit, but that kind of flying by your seat of your pants is quite a common feeling, I think, for people working in bringing together working in integrative research. And the thing that used to wake me up at night was the knowledge that the things that we did well and the mistakes that we did, the mistakes that we made, the things that we did badly, they all had consequence. Like this wasn't just a random experiment over here that you could just repeat. This was because you were doing it in a live process. It had consequence, it had impact. And if we did things badly, then it impacted on that land you can see, that water you can see, and those people who are there. So you can imagine that as a scientist, I was pretty keen to learn what had already been done, like what was in the literature, what was out there. And as a biophysical scientist coming into this role, what I found were two things. One was the literature was really fragmented. Like there was stuff out there, but it was really hard to get to, often wasn't very practical, and was in language that was really impenetrable to me at the start. And secondly, what I was really looking for was to evidence of why do you do this stuff? Like I wanted some evidence. I wanted some people to have tested some frameworks and say, if you do this, these are the consequences and these are the things that are really important. And that was very, very thin on the ground. So when I left ECAN, which I did in 2015 or 16, I really wanted to do something useful with the all of the experience and trauma that I gained from that period of time. And I wanted to do something about those two challenges. So the first challenge about the lack of evidence, and the second challenge about the lack of accessibility. And that's really guided my work for the last, since then. And I'm going to talk to you today about the first one, and then Helen's going to talk to you about all of the work that's going on, especially in her work that's going on in that second one, to make these things more accessible. So we so some colleagues and I in 2015 got the opportunity to start doing some research on integrative research, and we decided to do a piece of work on the integration and implementation science framework, which is something that I'd seen quite late on in my work in the SOAN, and it looked pretty useful, but again there wasn't any evidence around what were the impacts of using it. And so we were pretty interested to see if we could actually build some of that evidence. So the question that we were asking was relatively simple to ask, if not to answer, which was, if a research project uses concepts in the I2S framework, is it likely to make the research more useful, and is it to next users, and is it likely to make the research have more real world impact? So the I2S framework, if you haven't come across it, came out about 10 or just under 10 years ago from Australia, and it was written up in a book called Disciplining Interdisciplinarity. And it covers 3 domains with 5 questions covering each domain, applicable across each domain. So the first domain covers bringing together everything that you know about a problem. And this is in the context of complex problems. So everything you know about a problem from academic research, different knowledge sources, different knowledge systems, stakeholder knowledge. So bringing it all together. And that's called synthesizing disciplinary and stakeholder knowledge. The second domain is about knowing or appreciating that everything about a complex problem can't be known. And so therefore, what can't be known and the remaining unknowns need to be accounted for in decision making, in policy and practice change. So how are you managing those unknowns? So that's called understanding and managing diverse unknowns. And the third one is about supplying policymakers or practitioners with a better understanding of the problems, both the knowns and the unknowns, in a way that supports them in making decisions and taking action. So that's called providing integrative research support for policy and practice change. So it's very much the domain of providing that support is very much seen as within the research project as opposed to something that just kind of happens hopefully afterwards. So, and then across all of these three domains, you've got these 5 repeating questions, and they're the ones that are marked here are the high level questions. There's a bunch of nested questions underneath, but they're basically covering what the research is trying to aiming to achieve and who is it trying to benefit, which knowledge is synthesized, which unknowns are considered, which aspects of policy and practice change are targeted. How the knowledge is synthesized, how those unknowns are understood and managed, how the integrative research support is provided by whom and when. The fourth one is about context. So what are the circumstances that can affect all of these 3 domains? And then the fifth one is basically what's the result, and seeking a reflection from the team and about how well they did across the research. So that was the framework that we thought had a lot of potential. And so in our research, we looked at 7 big agri-environmental research projects that were all completed, that were considered to be researching complex problems. So those were the case studies we used. And in order to make this framework, this I2S framework, evaluatable, if that's the word, we broke it down into maybe 50 or 60 different elements, and we designed interviews and workshops and surveys to ascertain the degree to which the research teams had used the concepts in the I2S. We also interviewed and surveyed next users, so those immediate recipients of the research, to understand what had worked well, what hadn't worked well, and from their perspective, what had happened as a result of the research. And we also looked at what the research teams had produced and anything kind of spin-off that we could kind of find. And we collected both qualitative and quantitative data, but with the qualitative data, in addition to providing a bunch of really, really rich information, we also scored it to allow us to build this kind of a quantitative relationship. And we had 7 assessors, so everybody was doing little bits that we all kind of coordinated. So in terms of the results, so this is what we were trying to do, understand the whether using the I2S elements can make the research more useful. And these are the 2 things that I'm comparing just now. So it was the degree to which those projects use those elements. So and then the degree of usefulness as assessed by the next users. So we came up with, so this is what we came up with. So we had found a pretty strong and significant positive relationship between those 2 things. Absolutely acknowledge it's only 7 case studies and 3 domains within case studies, so we only have 21 data points, but still it's suggestive of a strongly suggestive of a relationship. And the strength of which really surprised us. So because we had 7 assessors, you kind of get a sense when you're looking at the data, you get a sense that something's emerging. but it was only when we put it together that we saw the strength of the relationship. And actually we were so surprised at the strength of the relationship that we went and did the calculations quite a few times just to make sure that we hadn't messed it up, because we really didn't expect to see anything this strong, and to see it through kind of all of the domains and all of the projects. So that was a really interesting interesting bit of research. So that was about the impact on the next users, and we published that last year. And this is a bit we haven't published yet, but this was around the trying to look at a real world impact. So we used a framework by Week et al. About 4 different types of impact. But what we found was, and this is again from the surveys, from the workshops, from the interviews, but also from looking at what the projects had produced, that we found that those that had considered to a greater extent the elements, so they did integrative research better, they produced more knowledge in general. They had more knowledge artifacts, but they had quite a lot of practical knowledge artifacts as well. Definitely had increased networks, because they had already included a bunch of people who wouldn't traditionally be included into their research programs, and because they'd spent a lot, they'd invested time in some of these practical and implementable research outputs, it meant that they were much more readily taken up. So we saw them in regional products or regional tools. We saw that in policies. We saw that in some of the projects were on farm. We saw that in on-farm practice change, or they saw that in on-farm practice change, and even to the point of changes in kind of science institutions. So I know we've seen a change across a couple of the CRIs whose this type of work has really informed how they try and do their integrative research. So we're kind of seeing both quantitatively and qualitatively, but quantitatively this the impact on next users, and qualitatively this impact on greater impact beyond the research team itself. And so super interesting. And I suppose I just wanted to finish off with, because this is kind of segues, I guess, into Helen's work. These were the characteristics of those case studies that were considered most useful and most effective. So first up, they were really clear on why they were doing integrative research. So, and the whole team was clear on why they were doing integrative research. They didn't do it just because it's a fun thing to do and it makes you really smiley, like the photos at the front showed. It's people had a very there was a reason, whether it was for greater systems knowledge, increased legitimacy, more socially robust outcomes, whatever. They had a reason for doing it. And that really guided how they did it, how they brought these things together, or how they brought different people or different knowledges, different insights together. The second one, and anybody that's been in or around iPEN will have heard this on many occasions, but considering impact right from the beginning. So thinking about it and thinking about how you're going to achieve it and designing it right from the beginning. And the reason why people bang on about it is because it really works. It's just, that was one of the really strongest things that came through. Thinking about multiple methods, so for doing the same thing. So every method that you use is only partial, and so trying to bring multiple methods, it might be around kind of communication, it might be around data synthesis, but doing it in kind of multiple ways means that you bring different people in and you bring different insights. Those projects that embraced uncertainty and used kind of reflection and adaptation, had built adaptation into their program for managing emergent nature of these types of programs, were that was kind of absolutely a characteristic of those that were most successful. And also, last couple of points is that those that really carefully considered their target audience, like they were not in a general way, oh, I'm going to benefit New Zealand, but actually quite specific way, like who are they, what does it feel like walking in their shoes? What does their world look like? What do they need? When do they need it? How do they need it? What do they need it for? So people who had that really clearly could very obviously design much more appropriately for that audience. And the really good ones had those people, had representatives of those people in the team. So they always kept the research team on focus. And that's the yep. So the last couple of points is that those really successful ones often had research teams that were funded beyond researchers, like they included other people and actually paid for some of their time. And they were really attentive to not just the disciplinary skills of the researchers, they really attended to those other necessary skills and qualities for doing this type of work. And we call them soft, but they're not soft, they're hard. They're hard to do. So the really best research teams, the ones that were most successful, paid attention to that, as well as just the CVs that people had and the qualifications that people had. So that's me. That's a little bit of the journey about putting some of the evidence of why to do integrative research, a little bit about the how, and then we're going to hear about from the proper expert about the how just now.
Thanks, Melissa. Over to you, Helen.
Oh, thank you, Melissa. That was great. And that's, yeah, I don't know about the proper expert at all, but thank you for your introduction and for leading us into this topic. Thank you also, Cara, for organising this, and for iPEN, and tēnā koutou katoa. Nice to see you all today. So I'll share my screen now, and someone can let me know that it's false. Actually, just wait. Share.
Yep, that's looking good.
And
You can see that on my split personality.
Beautiful. That's probably on the wrong display, is it?
Yes,
Yep.
that's right.
That's it.
There we go. Perfect.
Beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to speak today from my experience, probably more than 20 years now, of being a funder, being part of, leading, or managing a portfolio of what we're calling interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research programs, particularly focusing on those that are looking at complex problems. I mean, you can get many versions of this definition, but we're talking about those really complex, knotty problems and needing teams that can address these. So this presentation is based on observation, evidence, and practice. A couple of years, or a few years ago now, and the Impact of Science workshop that actually kicked off this iPEN project, which we're now part of now, and is delivering these seminars. Dr. Viv Smith, who was at the time part of the Social Policy Evaluation and Research Unit, gave us this quote, which, although in the context of impact, which was the topic of the day, equally applies to this. There is no shortage of what she called keen or helpful stuff. We do have our case studies and frameworks and toolkits and papers and so on. But what there is a shortage of is the why and the how. Now, Melissa's beautifully outlined the why. Why is there a rationale for working in this way? I'm going to focus today a bit more about the how. But spoiler alert, it's not a how-to recipe. There just isn't a recipe. And I really liked Melissa's analogy of the swamp and the handrails in the swamp, which is the title of her paper. There are guidelines, there are guiding principles, and there's certain things which I'll try and give a flavour of in this talk following this structure. Things like an institutional context, adapting approaches for your own context, the idea of training, mentoring, and peer learning, the option to have resources and communications that are adapted for context, and then this whole idea of monitoring, evaluation, reflecting, and learning what works, putting it into practice, adapting it, and trialing it again, because we are in new territory in some of this area. So starting with some of the guiding principles, This is something we've been looking at for a while now in ag research, building on our initial work and how you get better uptake and impact of research. And this echoes some of the findings from Melissa's talk, and also for those who've seen similar frameworks, for example, the success principles or the co-innovation principles that MS and team presented at an earlier seminar, iPEN seminar a couple of months ago. But 6 factors that seem to come through, and we've identified these within our own programs that we've been looking at, but also through interviews with innovative research practitioners. And these are some of the things that are needed. We talked about the collaborative approach, the multiple knowledge discipline to provide an integrative perspective, a more holistic and integrative perspective. This brings in the concepts of systems thinking, but it also brings in multiple worldviews and the idea of, which leads into the next one, on societal values around having outcomes that are economic, social, environmental, and cultural. The concept of reflexivity, being reflexive as a researcher or a team member, but also building in that ongoing reflection, adaptation, learning, and so on. The active participation of partners and stakeholders throughout the life of the program, not just from the beginning. And then this concept around structural change. So it's not just tweaking around the edges, but getting deeper into the actual issue or the problem that to be addressed, and looking at some of those levers to bring about change. Another way of looking at it, and this also echoes some of the findings of Melissa, is the idea that some of, and in this table, I'm not trying to say it's better or worse or an either or, even though it's a from to, but I think we could say the two are the types of characteristics of a research, transdisciplinary integrative research program looking in the complex space. So it's horses for courses. If you've got a complex issue that you're grappling with, this is the type of thing that you need to be aware of. It is longer term, it's future focused, it's adaptive, emergent. Knowledge, including mātauranga, is valued equally in our context. It is not a tack on or something that is at the side. So it's these kind of characteristics that are what we're talking about here. And this was expressed probably better than I can by some of our interviews when we talk to researchers working in these complex integrative programs. And for example, this one bringing out that holistic view, less about the components, more about the bigger picture. And also the way of working, getting out of your comfort zone, and that future focus as well. The concept that it is challenging and there's certain skills to make it work. It's not just a matter of, okay, let's just all do integrative research now and jump in the room together. And the idea that it needs support now, whether this is from the company or the organisation or the research organisation or the things like a national science challenge to be able to work in this way. It's not just the project team, but it's everything around it that needs to be in place. So delving into that supportive institutional context, in our organisational situation, we've talking about the T platform, where T stands for transdisciplinary and transformative research. This is just one approach. There's many, and many other organisations are doing different things, but this is a platform that we've got in ag research to enable and support how you build the capacity and capability amongst researchers and partners to be able to work in these complex integrative programs in a better way. It's relatively new. We only started this in November. Originally, with the diagram, it was originally conceptualized as a one-stop shop, but now it's more, we're thinking it's a library approach. So it's learning from each other's, trying something out, adapting it, bringing it back, talking about it. How do we learn and build on what we've got to get that collective body of knowledge amongst each other? And how do we get better at this as a research community is what we're about here. So I'm just going to show some of the things, some of the approaches that the platform is doing. As a practice-based platform, we're not so much about research, it's about trialing and doing and learning. And I should point out that these approaches are not, we haven't invented them, they're not new, but what we're doing is putting them into our context. How do they work in a research organisation? What can we learn? Do they work better, or do they add value basically to our research is what we're looking at. So things like speculative design, design thinking is another approach here within the context of a complex problem. So not just design for a tool or a process, but for a large complex issue. And in this case, it was used for strategy. Other ideas around building futures literacy, using the ideas of systems innovation approaches where you're thinking much more bigger picture, and what are some of the ways of thinking or stretching that thinking to allow that to happen. It's not all workshopping, although often it can be, but it is around building that knowledge within a group of people to be able to think about what you're going to do and what the impact is. Another part of this is introducing regular reflection sessions with the idea that hopefully you'll get some kind of light bulb moments, but reflecting on what's been done, what's working, what's not working, again, being able to build in that adaptation as you go. And it's easy to say these sort of things, but what we're trying to say is, okay, how do you do that? What works? What's easy? What's doable within your working situation? Moving on to the how we're learning and building up the skills, and one way is through communities of practice. Some are housed within the platform I'm talking about, some are within other parts of the organisation, but emphasis really is on the practice and building a trust amongst a group to be able to share their knowledge or what they know, learning from others, putting that back, and learning around a particular topic area and how we can make that work. And again, it's more than just bringing a bunch of people together to have a conversation, although that's great, but it's the support and the facilitation that goes around it as well is really important part of this. So it's that real learning from each other, and it's hugely valuable. That can sit alongside more formal training, and there's all sorts of formal, and I'm sure in your organisations too, formal opportunities. I loved how Melissa called it hard skills. They are hard skills, some of these, and some of them can't be trained, but some things, like for example, a knowledge of facilitation is just one small example, which really helps in some of these more participatory programs where you've got multiple views and need to bring it together. And that's associated with training, but also mentoring, and again, building up that collective knowledge and collective muscle. There are other toolkits around. Manaaki Whenua also have an integrative toolkit. There's international ones as well. But this is our example of bringing together our knowledge and learning and what works, and things like run sheets and facilitation run sheets, and putting it into a way that makes sense with what's needed for when you need to use it at the different stages. So that's available publicly, but it's really just a repository of what works, and again, that adaptation of what works for our situation that may or may not be useful for yours. Hopefully will be. And then finally, the monitoring and evaluation, reflection and learning. So does our intervention, or does working in this different way, or what we're trying to achieve, is that making a difference? Is what was on that side of the table that I showed in the beginning around more adaptive, more bigger picture thinking, things that admittedly will take a lot more time. There's time and effort and resources needed to build relationships, to set up programs in this way, and to work across stakeholders and multiple disciplines. So is it worth the effort is really what we're asking. And is by having a platform such as ours also helping with that. So it's really important to be able to assess that. We've built in our own monitoring and evaluation, but another way that we've been using, which is also useful and anyone can do, is to put it into a practice note. So what are your experiences? What's worked? What hasn't worked? What were some of the challenges? Again, some of those light bulb moments, so others can learn from your experiences. Of course, there's different contexts, but some of the principles will help and remain the same. And then just again, some things around implementing these type of approaches. Again, some of the things that are necessary within a team or within an organisation. So it is openness to new ways of working or innovating. It's not for everyone. That's fine, as long as there's enough in the team to keep it moving. Buy-in from leadership or organisational support from others. We mentioned the support in the training. To have some autonomy, to be able to try something, to do something different, to be able to be a bit creative in how you do your solutions, and then that diversity of team. So those are the sort of the formal things, but my own reflections, it can be a bit of a sticky space to work in. It's not for everyone, but there's a lot we can learn from each other and get better at. While there's no recipe, things like communities of practice notes, examples, tools, learnings from others are really useful. That support from the organisation and from others in your team or around you is really important. The expectation to move and change and adapt and have people come and go is just part of it. The leadership, really critical, preferably co-leadership, because and not just around the disciplinary leadership. The best leadership in these multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary teams are people that can put their discipline at the door and be a true collaborative leader. Ultimately, though, it's a mindset, willingness to work, willingness to try something different, and all about relationships. And if it's right, it can be really rewarding. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen. I was going to say that that comment about, I think it was your second or your third bullet point around, you know, actually where a lot of the value is that talking with one another and that sort of thing. And transdisciplinary research can be a little bit like parenting. You know, you sort of cobble together your approach to parenting based on a whole wide range of things that you might read on the internet and conversations with family members and other parents. It's you have to be really you really have to kind of understand your own kids who you don't necessarily actually understand that well. Anyway, someone was just asking if you could pop up the last slide, Helen. So the floor is open for questions, either to Melissa or Helen or to both. So you're welcome to either use Slido or the chat. And I can see someone's got their hand up. Just let me bring up the people pane so that I can see you. Oh, Alvaro, nice to see you. Shoot,
nice to see you.
The floor is yours.
Thanks, Helen and Melissa. Very interesting presentation. For me, one thing I was thinking in one of Melissa's presentation, one slide, the importance of knowing the impact that you want to achieve. And you really re-emphasize that, but that's really difficult, if not impossible, in many situations. So I don't know. Do you want to comment? Because I think all of us have been through. And you mentioned trauma. it's not exaggeration for many of us. But yeah, the criticality of finding where you are going, what's the impact that you want to achieve, and how hard it is. Yeah.
Right, Melissa, over to you.
Great question. Thank you. So I think it is critical. But I'd also acknowledge that what you intend to achieve and what you do end up achieving are not necessarily the same things. But it's the thing is, if you don't have something that you're designing for, if you don't have a thing in mind that if you just want to change policy, or if you just want people to do something different on farms, but you don't think about the system that farmer works in, or where the policymaker is, you don't think about that world, or you don't think about what and who and when you need to target, then your chances of being effective are so much less. And we wouldn't leave, when we're designing experiments, there are some things that we let emerge, but there are other things that we'd never leave that. We would never leave that entirely open when we're designing research, but we do when we're designing for impact. And so it's just having it, and it takes more work to do it up front, because you need to be well immersed in the problem, and well immersed with the range of people who are experiencing the problem. But to me, that's, if you design it, then you have much less problem in you don't have to retrofit anything when it kind of comes out the end. So it is a challenge. I absolutely absolutely acknowledge that, but I think that's some of the hard design work that you do at the start, which is a lot easier than trying to retrofit something at the end.
Yeah. Alvaro, just one quick follow-up question to that. When you were talking about the impact trauma, I think you called it. When you say that, what do you mean?
I mean trying to get up the ground an integrated initiative where people have different worldviews, different ideas of what the impact they want to achieve, and you go in circles and you get stuck, and people get stuck getting really frustrated. And the problem, to me, typical problem, is you cannot agree on what you want to achieve. Sometimes you cannot, but then you need to move on anyway, because the clock is ticking, because you have certain number of very limited time allocated to the project.
Alvaro, I think what you've raised is a really legitimate question. So if we can just take another little moment for both Helen and Melissa to respond, because getting out the door is almost the hardest part. Helen, Melissa, do you want to comment on your own experience?
You have a go, Helen.
So if I've got the question right, it's how you design for impact when time is short. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, and so Alvaro was just describing that real challenge, when different worldviews, different ideas about what are we trying, how do you wrestle the octopus is how I often describe it.
Yeah. And I think
cannot agree on it. You cannot agree on the north. Where are you going?
Yeah, well, and I think that's where the iPEN group is. This is sort of one of your whole reasons for being, isn't it? To provide that training, tools, approaches of how to do that. And there are some great ways of doing it, and understanding, like Melissa said, this, you might not get there, but you've got to have a direction. You've got to have that. It's like a map, right? Where are you heading? And what are the steps along the way to get there, which become your outcomes? And then how are you going to show that? How are you going to evidence that? It's not enough to say, oh, we're going to change the world. It's what is the tangible things along that stepping stone. So that's what it's about. Now, how you bring people to do that, again, are some of these things that we've been talking about. The different methods, the different approaches to bring people together and to get that shared understanding.
Yeah. Melissa, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking of two projects where we absolutely had that. We just could not decide on what North was. We just and so um, in both of those projects, what we could decide on is what the next step was. So it wasn't North. It wasn't like our kind of total impact, because there was so much uncertainty between now and then that people couldn't. They just we just kept getting lost in the middle. We just getting lost in the kind of discussion and really, because this was about science for regulation, or science for policy and science for regulation. And so there were all of the kind of different views about, the role of regulation and the role, and what kind of, so there were some quite deep ethical and different kind of worldviews that were coming to play here. So we couldn't get a decision on that. And so what we could do is take a step, is decide on the next step to see, and that didn't, but we could only do that when we could see it didn't preclude anybody's options. So, and what we did, we designed, for the first couple of stages, we designed a kind of a bit of a lockstep. And so we take a first step, and then we couldn't go backwards, but we could agree that, and then we could take the next step forward. So with that project, with both of those projects, we didn't get that real clarity of purpose until a little bit later on. But we did have a sort of a pragmatic way that we could actually agree on what we were going to do, what we were going to work on for the next, for the next period of time, because that wasn't going to preclude anybody's outcomes. So that was really good. But the one, so I just in on that, I made a real mistake. I made a real error in that one of the projects that I was leading, is that there were things that I thought were non-negotiable, or there were things that were non-negotiable from the project. They were, they'd been kind of given to us. But I made the mistake when I was leading that of meaning that they were non-discussable. So what I should have done is even though there was a we didn't have any room to move, it didn't mean that we didn't need to discuss. And that was actually, I think, one of the things that stopped us being able to find the true north, is that we didn't get to discuss all of the things that were, the problems that people had with the framing, because they were non-negotiable. So to me, the big learning that I had is non-negotiable doesn't mean non-discussable.
Yeah, that's such a great reflection, Melissa. Thank you. Yeah, and I think the other thing is that I think sometimes we forget, but working in these ways involves far more actually working with people and their various different perspectives and views, and working with people is much more predictable and messier. And if it was easy, these challenges would have been solved already. It's so if we just remember that if it's feeling difficult, it's more of a reflection of the challenges that we're trying to work around, and just sort of, patiently stand with that, but then using some of those really practical suggestions, Melissa, that you've just been describing is really helpful as well. And the only other thing I'd add, Alvaro, is sometimes it's quite useful to have sort of an outsider to the team come in and help sort of with some of that facilitation. It can just take a bit of the heat or the emotion out of the discussions. Yeah. And actually, Victoria, that kind of segues a little bit to your question about how do you identify what stakeholders to prioritise for each method in a way that is complementary. I think you're talking about possibly each type of approach that you're talking about. I might invite you just to take yourself off mute, if you could just expand if you're able to. Yeah.
I think she was the presenter was sharing that you'd have to use different methods so that you are filling gaps, because each method has a bias. And I was trying to understand how you don't create response fatigue by making sure you're segregating your stakeholders properly, and how you do that in a way that is not exclusive.
Yeah, good question. Melissa? Oh, or Helen, yeah, but to both of you.
You go
Yeah,
first, Melissa.
yeah. It's a really good question, actually. With the methods that what I was specifically referring to, they weren't really they were with a kind of the broader research team. And so we weren't doing multiple things with the same stakeholders. What we were trying to do is, as those projects within their research teams were cutting things multiple ways in order to make sure that they built the richest picture, or the kind of the richest insight into the problem that they were trying to solve. And so I'm sure the research team would have got quite fatigued, but they were being paid to be there, so it's a bit trite, but they're you're absolutely right that if you were doing this with kind of your stakeholders, people who were more distant from the research team, then you would have to think about not bombarding them and confusing them and wearing them out.
Yeah. Helen, do you want to add anything further to that?
Yeah, there's quite a few levels here, because there's the which stakeholders, and then the stakeholder fatigue question. So there's this great concept of who's in the room and why. So in other words, it's not just pulling in your favourite friends, although sometimes that is appropriate, but it is starting to look at the picture, who needs to be there, or who should be there, who should have a voice. And there's various approaches and methods and tools you can use to help identify that. But then, of course, then it's a matter of who wants to be there, who can be there, and who can contribute, and who has an equal voice. So there's all those sort of questions around, what does the partnerships look like? Getting paid equally, or recompensed for your time, or some reciprocal arrangement, and so on. So it's yeah, there's a lot in this topic.
Yes, there is, and again, that's where having experts in the room to help with that process in those early stages is really valuable. Things like systems thinking, and understanding, multiple perspectives. And so again, getting someone who can just help prompt you to think about those, the who and the why, again at the get-go, is quite helpful, because then actually a lot of the rest of it kind of takes care of itself, because you've taken the time to understand, what part of the picture do they see, and how do they see it, and therefore why might you need to engage with them at certain times. So
and I think that's a really good case, like in terms of systems thinking. So there are multiple ways that you can use systems thinking, and that's kind of what I was meaning in terms of multiple methods. So for some people, and for some particular things, like a rich picture might be a really nice way of like, it makes sense to people. And there are things that you'll pick up that from doing a rich picture that you wouldn't pick up doing a causal loop diagram. And there are things that you'd pick up in a causal loop diagram that you won't pick up doing a rich picture. So thinking, even when you say, right, we're going to use systems thinking about the a few different ways that you can that you can use, a few different methods that you can use, that they attract different people and they draw different things out. And based on that, then you get a richer insight, a richer picture of what's going on.
No pun intended.
Yes.
Does anyone have any other questions? We've got 3 minutes before we need to sign off. And if not, otherwise, I'm going to invite Helen or Melissa for any final comments, any provocations, or encouragements. Helen, why don't you go first?
No, just it's a keen to hear from any of you if you want to make contact or continue this conversation. And thanks again for iPEN for facilitating bringing some of these concepts and ideas out into the open. It's great.
Yeah. Thanks, Helen. Melissa?
Yeah, obviously echo that, and I'd also I think there's some great resources that have been generated across the CRIs within iPEN. iPEN's a really good portal to some of these resources, and there's some stuff that's really good. It's aimed at people taking their first steps, and that's really there hasn't been a lot of that in the past, that's aimed at people taking their first steps. So there is stuff that you can do that is not a massive stretch, that isn't a massive risk, but that can really, start to just bring you different insights into your research. So I would encourage people to, have a look.
And also probably to know that there isn't one, as Helen was saying, there isn't a recipe to follow here. And that's quite freeing, but quite scary all at the same time. So, but just knowing that what's going to work for a particular project and program, it will not necessarily be the same for another, but that doesn't stop you trying to take learnings and then, assimilate that into your own context for your own stakeholders and your own sort of challenge or opportunity. Yeah. Well, look, thank you, everyone, for coming online. Thank you again so much to Melissa and Helen. It's been great to be able to share your insights and learning. If you've got any questions, get in touch. We'll be making this available. I will be uploading it so others can watch it, or you can watch again. We'll share the links to Melissa's Melissa's paper, and otherwise, please feel free to get in touch with any of us if you've got any questions about what might be some good starting places for those toolkits. But both the Ag Research Beyond Results and the T Platform stuff and Melissa's Integrated Research Portal are both two really great places to go, as well as iPEN's website. So thanks very much. Have a fantastic rest of your day, everybody. And best of luck with whatever you're working on today. Ka kite.
Ka kite.